Thanks for everyone putting your message in the chat. Always good for us to see. I think we will get started. My name is Judy Margles. I'm the director of the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. I want to thank you for joining us for resisting the global threat of fascism and conspiracy theory. This will be a conversation with Talia Lavin and Shane Burley. We especially want to thank this program's lead sponsor, the Middleman Jewish Community Center, and the Costner Cultural Education Fund, joined by co-sponsors, the Anti-Defamation League Pacific Northwest, Jewish Federation of Greater Portland, and our own Rabbi Joshua Stamfer Cultural Program Fund. I also want to thank Amber Curson for handling the tech for this program, and Saul Corin, Director of Donor Engagement and Philanthropy at the Jewish Community Center, and Gail Mandel, Deputy Director here at the museum, who put this program together. April's bursting with events in observance of Genocide Awareness Month. I'll just mention one. It takes place on April 7th, Resisting Cultural Erasure in America, with Barrett Holmes Pittner and Jennifer Fang. Looking forward, this summer, we're organizing the exhibition Turning Inward, Works by Judy Chicago, from the collection of Jordan Schnitzer and his family foundation. It opens on June 2nd. I have to say, we're definitely planning to raise some good trouble with this exhibition. Included in the museum's mission is a challenge to resist indifference and discrimination and to envision a just and inclusive world. This imperatively drives us to teach our audiences that we have a responsibility to one another and that apathy, passivity, and inaction to injustice can result in public disaster. One of the ways that we fulfill these pursuits is through programs like this that allow us to look intently at some of the unrelenting problems facing us today, that we can be in partnership with colleagues and organizations that share our goals, make our work that much more rewarding. I'm so grateful to Talia Lavin and Shane Burley for being with us, as they are precisely the experts we need to help us to understand the folly of conspiracy theory and, conversely, how anti-fascism manifests itself. And I will just introduce our two presenters this evening. Shane Burley is a writer and filmmaker based here in Portland. He is the author of Why We Fight, Essays on Fascism, Resistance, and Surviving the Apocalypse, and Fascism Today, What It Is and How to End It. He's also the editor of the forthcoming book, No Passaran, Anti-Fascist Dispatches from a World in Crisis, for which Talia Lavin wrote the foreword. His work has been featured on NBC News, The Daily Beast, Jewish Currents, Haaretz, and the Oregon Historical Society, the Oregon Historical Quarterly, to name a few. His newest article, How to Understand the Research on Social Media and Anti-Semitism, just dropped on Patreon. Talia Lavin's book, Culture Warlords, My Journey into the Dark Web of White Supremacy, which interrogates how radicalization occurs, is a fearsome read that has become even more astonishing considering the myriad of crises at home and abroad. In addition to her journalistic focus on far-right movements, she's also the writer behind the newsletter, The Sword and the Sandwich, a chronicle of the varying facets of the American right, and an ode to sandwiches. She's been published in GQ, New York Times Review of Books, New York Magazine, The New Republic, and The Nation, to name some. Her next book centers on the communities that white supremacists spring from. And for any of us who listened in last night to Chris Nichols' conversation with Timothy Snyder, offered by the Oregon Historical Society, I very much appreciated Snyder's admonition to all of us to be ethical in our journalistic habits by supporting the writers like Talia and Shane, who use vehicles such as Substack or Patreon to get their works out to a larger audience. I would urge all of us to pay for the media that we consume. Tonight's program is going to be conversational in format. We really welcome your questions. I think you know the drill. You put your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Please don't put your questions in the chat. And I want to welcome Shane, who's going to be moderating the program with Talia. Welcome to both of you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Judy. I want to say a big thanks to all the sponsoring organizations. I think a lot of their events coming up are pretty exciting. You know, so Talia and I both have been kind of in this dark web for a long time, researching the far right. I think it's kind of interesting to go back to how it started, how at least how, we kind of started with it. I very early on was attending graduate school up in upstate New York, and there was a series of Holocaust denial events there. And in an effort to kind of figure out what was going on, where they were coming from, I stumbled on a kind of little known person at the time, Richard Spencer, who had a small blog, so 2010, 2011. And that's sort of how I got started and kind of locked into constantly covering the far right. How did you, Talia, get first involved in researching the far right?
I mean, I guess it's a bit of a stock answer, but the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, those images, it's something that I'd encountered and been curious about before, but that moment, particularly the sort of virulence of anti-Semitism on physical display, really made me start questioning a lot of the assumptions I had about Jewish life in the US, about my place in the US. And so I began writing about the far right that year in 2017, and they noticed me and wrote about me. And I'm a pretty stubborn and stiff-necked person, so I kind of just stuck with it, doubled down.
I think and they really noticed you too right away. I mean, you wrote a lot about, you talk about in the book, and you talked about some other stuff about the way that they put disproportionate focus on you. When I first started writing, I was totally ignored by them. And then over time, it comes up now and again, but in a very, not as an intensely threatening way, usually, other than, having my information posted, that kind of thing. Well, how do you think that journalists and anti-fascists in general are targeted by them? And how do you think that your experience has differed, or how do you think your experience has been distinct anyway?
I mean, I just want to clarify. I mean, I think I included some of my own experiences in my book and other pieces, largely as an illustrative measure, and also because, often we can speak most strongly about our personal experiences. So, the brutality of these movements is often manifest in how they speak to people, how they treat people, which is usually, generally not well. I'm queer, I'm Jewish, I am a woman, and all of these have factored into my treatment, by the far right. They're writing about me. I think, what often gets missed in writing by men about these movements is how fundamental misogyny is to these movements, just absolutely central, anti-feminism and misogyny. And so every woman I know who writes about the far right gets just exponentially more and more sexualized and more violent harassment than any man I know. There's also, of course, I'm a Jew. So I'm, part of the group that's public enemy number one in a really profoundly central way to the white supremacist movement. I mean, really, it's sort of the building block of their entire worldview, that every Jew is a schemer, etc. And so these are intersecting elements that have led to my particular targeting, as far as outspoken critics of the far right go. But I think that's broadly true for women, for Jews, for people of color who speak out against fascism and fascist movements, who research these movements, who write about them, get disproportionately and very personalized and very violent and very misogynistic and or racist and or anti-Semitic blowback in ways that majority of writers on the beat who are sort of straight Christian men do not.
Yeah, I think there was a direct correlation to the first time I published something about being queer, having queer relationships, the first time I published something about being Jewish. And then when other people sort of referred to me as an anti-fascist, either activist or journalist, however it was phrased, that seemed to be one of the key markers that, this person is fair game for abuse and attack. You can post their personal information, you can, post their phone number, call them, threaten them, that kind of thing. There's various levels. Anytime I got more personal public, that's when it got worse. It felt like, pushing back at any kind of personal exposure. Don't be don't bring my whole self to public at all.
Yeah, whereas I've sort of continued to rather defiantly either put myself bravely out there, show my whole ass, depending on who you're talking to. I do live quite a public life, but I think, it's worth it to sort of continue to be defiant in our joy, as it were. But yeah, I mean, but even from the get, like way before I had the kind of Twitter following I do now, or before the book, it was sort of from the first time, the first moment I wrote a word about the far right, it was very like, you know, literally they were like, the real Holocaust didn't happen, but like people like this, not so nice word for people, make me want to create one. Um, so, and going after my family and all this and that. Really, I mean, I do take security precautions, like scrubbing my information from the internet and not posting my location and this and that. Sort of a perennial worry, and I have had the FBI come to me about death threats and stuff like that. But you know, we mosey on. We'll be fine, or it won't.
Why do you think people are always so obsessed with the idea of de-radicalization? I mean, we've talked about this before. It's something I get asked at almost every event I've ever done, is like, what methods can we take for de-radicalization? And I kind of want to push back to people and say, don't we want to talk about pre-radicalization? Like, what are the conditions that bring it about? And also, isn't safety the most important thing? Isn't actually stopping the advance of fascist organizations and people the most important? Why do you think people are so kind of dialed into this concept of de-radicalization?
Yeah, I think you and I have thinking that's much more attuned on this, like as sort of practicing anti-fascists, as sort of people who are plugged into that community. But I have noticed there is this, the more sort of reactionary or like right wing or even sort of very centrist in audiences, the more interested they are in de-radicalization. If I'm being extremely cynical and critical, I think it is because globally, part of the reason white supremacy and extremism is covered so abysmally poorly and sort of treated with such laxity in the US is because most white people in the United States feel more sympathy for extremists than they do their victims. So, people absolutely will prioritize the life slash career slash good name of, a racist man or woman who is like saying racist things in public, doing, racist things, versus their sort of marginalized, like people of color, trans people, and Jews, like they will defend the good name of a racist for like ever. And so my cynical brain says, people want a nice kumbaya arc. People want to say like art, like I see myself in these people, and so can't they be redeemed in some fashion? Maybe it's partially like a Christian notion of redemption. Maybe again, it's this sympathy or mirroring, or like there, but for the grace of God go I. And like, so why can't we just shake each other's hands and civility ourselves out of a race war? I needless to say, like, I think my words started dripping with contempt speak for me, but I think I agree with you that the emphasis should be on pre-radicalization, i.e. stopping the pipelines of radicalization, gumming up the works, deplatforming, the many bad faith actors on the internet who sort of grease up the slope down towards joining extremist groups, towards physically countering fascist groups in the street, towards trying to ensure that fascists can't hold their events and their rallies, through many other means, doing research, dossiers. Like there are 10 million zillion things that you can do to counter fascism that are like more useful than talking to me about like shouldn't shouldn't we be de-radicalizing them? I also think that people don't really understand just how unscalable de-radicalization is.
Mhm.
Like the two stories I know, successful de-radicalization, one is Megan Phelps Roper, who was from childhood, a member of the Westboro Baptist Church. She just was born into that family. She basically was the Twitter presence for the Westboro Baptist Church, and someone DM'd her, and sort of slowly over a period of literally years, got to basically got her out of that set of beliefs and away from her family, and they're married. I mean, now they're married. So, are you gonna, and then
Just marry every Nazi and that'll turn them around.
just marry every Nazi? No. And the other is the story, Eli Saslow's book about the son of the founder of Stormfront, who sort of very slowly, he went to a liberal arts college, and slowly after his identity was unmasked, so after there was sort of student anti-fascist activity of saying, hey, this guy's a white nationalist, there was a Jewish student who then invited him to Shabbat dinner. He decided to go, and over the course of 4 years was sort of slowly, inch by inch, talked out of his belief system until he came to publicly renounce the white nationalism. So first of all, it takes a tremendous amount of time. It is deeply personal. The person in question has to be ready to receive it, to leave these movements. And also, there's a very real risk, especially when it comes to people who are not practiced, who are just random. Propaganda works both ways. You may find yourself falling under the influence or thinking these ideas are reasonable. So de-radicalization is sort of, I have nothing against it, but it's not where to pour money. It's not scalable. It's not a practical solution to the burgeoning problem of fascism. And you start by, to my mind, the way to sort of places to pour your resources, your energy, your time is in, again, stopping the pipeline so that people are pre-de-radicalized by never becoming fascists in the first place. And second of all, raising the social cost of being a fascist, really making people pariahs when they, removing the wiggle room. If you are publicly unmasked as a member of a racist group, there's no compromise with you. It's just total pariahdom. And I think seeing that may make some people shy away from joining these groups in the first place. But I think these strategies are just much more, frankly, more efficient. And note that I'm not talking about law enforcement here. I'm not talking about countering violent extremism, which is a program that was initiated by DHS to surveil Muslims and largely continues in that mission above all things. CVE groups get the most money out of anyone in the sort of combating the far right space. The vast majority of anti-fascist work in the US is completely volunteer. But CVE groups are intimately linked with law enforcement. CVE groups also are just come from this punitive carceral and state sort of a network that I think makes them uniquely unsuited to deal with the problem. What's your take on CVE?
Largely the same. It's a law enforcement solution that doesn't get to the root of the problem in reality. And if we look numerically, it's anti-fascist groups, it's organizers, those are the people that logistically have shut down the most events, which is a direct pipeline to keeping people safe and stopping the movements from growing. I think there's this sort of liberal mythology around de-radicalization that all we need is really good education, maybe some kind of intervention, smarter people than them can come in and change their mind with well-reasoned arguments. And I think it's disconcerting, the idea that, that just the liberal democratic project can't just solve this problem on its own. And it creates, in a lot of ways, this whole industry of like super high paid consultants of former white nationalists going on speaking tours. And a lot of these organizations that if you kind of scrape just a little bit beneath the surface, the views of these people actually haven't changed much. They're being given like
light after light.
yeah, I mean, like, and that's a really great example where like all it took was literally asking a few of their former radicals that are speaking what their views actually were. And it was very, very clear that they hadn't made any of those changes and that a very low bar was there. And I don't think, I mean, that I think the logic behind that is if we keep the bar low, it'll help people get out. But what we've seen is all it does is actually give a cover to people to further organize, to stop like methods that can actually shut them down. And then with CVE groups, I mean, they go after, you know, the same organizers doing anti-fascist work, just like they go after the far right. And the more you empower them, like you said, they'll go after, Islamic groups. They go after a lot of folks that are also historically marginalized. And so it's not actually a pathway directly to fighting white nationalism.
I mean, as anti-fascists, we talk about the three-way fight, the sort of opposition to state violence, opposition to fascist violence. You know, that there's sort of a triangle and we're opposed to both. That's why so often you'll see, you know, anti-fascists beaten by the cops. You know, especially because the cops in the US are like explicitly, openly aligned with the far right in many senses. I think we actually put questions in the Q&A.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Function, not the chat. But yeah, just to answer a question, CVE is Countering Violent Extremism, which is a set of programs funded by the government and affiliated with law enforcement. And I think it's precisely that affiliation that makes them so. But yeah, de-radicalization is really, to me, like it's a playground fantasy. I mean, it's a fantasy more than it is anything. It's easy to throw money at, it feels good. And it also allows you to then cast people who are using other more efficient measures as violent, as unreasonable, as sort of inherently flawed. You know, you cannot debate your way out of extremism. That's not how it works. Like extremism starts out appealing to emotion and conspiracy theory as well. You know, what they do is find a lacuna in your life. So it started just from loneliness, from a feeling of lack of purpose, from a feeling of, you know, like disappointment with your life, feeling that you were entitled to more, feeling that you were entitled to better, wanting to be part of something bigger. Very normal and even like salubrious and fine human emotions that all of us have experienced at one time or another. But fascists are very keen to exploit them, and they're very good at exploiting them. And they tell a story, which is, come join the white race, you'll be a hero, you'll be part of this community, you'll be part of something bigger, every action you take will have meaning. And we certainly see the same thing with QAnon, where there's this sort of sense of we're saving the world, we're fighting the satanic pedophile cabal, like the stakes are very existential. There is community to be found. There is community to be found in these groups. You know, going out with your buddies and your khakis and putting racist stickers up, you know, that is a form of community. It's also a violent community. So that makes it even harder to leave. But like either way, you know, appeals to logic, or saying that it's all born of ignorance, which I hear a lot. You know, there's a very profoundly classist approach to the like common liberal talking points about fascism. There's this sort of archetype that I refer to as the toothless Cletus that people like to bring up. Oh, it's ignorant rednecks, it's people in the South, it's people with no education, it's people with no job and no life and no family. And that's just not the case. I mean, it's not like, no, like not everyone is sort of cream of the crop or whatever, but there are plenty of people with regular jobs, regular lives, you know, people with educations. Richard Spencer went to Duke, right? Because this is not about educational attainment. It's not about zip code. It's not about wealth, even. It's about these emotional hooks. And every one of us is vulnerable to that sort of exploitation from the right cause at the right time. You know, and you cannot debate your way out of that kind of emotional connection. And also the fear of leaving a violent group and the fear of saying, I was wrong. This entire aspect of my identity was wrong. My life has been in the wrong direction, which is a very difficult thing to say, a very difficult thing to admit, and not something that you can sort of do over like a goodwill cookout. Like people love, you know, this guy Daryl Davis, who you know, claims to have talked a lot of people out of the Klan, right? And he gets a lot of press and a lot of money, and I don't think he's a bad guy, but a lot of the quote unquote former Klansmen that he claims to have converted are still unrepentant, open racists, and he appears at these events that and functionally winds up giving sort of unearned legitimacy to events like, for example, an event I covered in my book, conference of radical right YouTubers and their fans, led by a notorious Portland area fascist scum, Andy Ngo. So, you know, I think there are real limits to the de-radicalization. The overemphasis on de-radicalization bespeaks a certain myopia and a certain sympathy and a certain ignorance about the nature of fascist movements, how they operate, and who they consist of.
I think like the Daryl Davis approach too, like of constantly sort of debating them necessitates giving them a platform, which also necessitates them growing. I mean, like they have to have access to speech to have this discourse that their thinking talks them out of radicalization, but that's exactly what radicalizes other people. So it's sort of like this self-defeating model. And I also feel like there's this notion that anti-fascists with volunteer organizations that are kind of doing like public protests and things like that, that's unnecessary because the police will keep you safe from the far right, which feels like a very privileged, sheltered understanding of how the police deal with this and not based in reality on what the track record of the police actually is when covering far right demonstrations or covering left-wing demonstrations. Like it's not like some dependable model where like we can be kept safe from the far right simply by the police and without, you know, community organizations taking some sort of self-defense stance.
Yeah, I mean, again, like the sort of undue centrality of de-radicalization is also and even principally used to marginalize people who are taking actually effective action against fascism. Yeah, and I mean, I could talk about this for a million hours, but you know, I just it does really bother me. But you know, I think part of the reason we're in the mess we are is like people are very prone to close their eyes to what's real and what isn't in these about these movements.
You know, there was a question that came in about what to do about like family members or friends that have been influenced by stuff, particularly like QAnon, conspiracy theories. You know, a lot of people have had like, especially over the last like 2 or 3 years, sort of like family members go off into conspiracy theories. And I think that's actually in a way probably part of what's behind this de-radicalization question. Is like people don't want to abandon like a family member that started to have these ideas. And what do you think about confronting people that are close to you with these ideas? What kind of strategies? I think that's an open question in a way. Like there's a number of books that have been written about like QAnon and kind of trying to pull people out, but what do you think?
Ooh, I mean, look, I don't think it's a lost cause. I think it may lead you to a lot of misery. I think you have to be very careful and certain in yourself, so as not to be swayed. Like again, don't think of yourself as invulnerable to propaganda and its emotional appeals. Like if you were going to engage in something like that, like be very certain in yourself. Be as stable as you can be before you engage in something like that. Be prepared for lack of success. But, you know, it's like, in a sense, it's like if you know people in an abusive relationship, the advice you often get is like, don't sort of like, you can like tell them that this is bad for them, tell them it's horrible, but like always make sure you're there for them, that you're open to them, that they know they can come to you, you know, with doubts or with whatever. Like I almost think of it like that. I also we had another question that isn't it better to just ignore far-right protesters when they come to town? And I think that's linked to your thought about how debating fascists is akin to giving them a platform. When you allow far-right groups to march openly, you are giving them the street. You are showing your town, but like, it's okay. We don't mind. We're friendly to this sort of thing. When these groups march unopposed, they garner attention, they garner recruits, they have the potential to devolve into violence. Like every single fascist event is designed for recruitment. And when, for example, the Proud Boys march, they almost inevitably assault people, you know, beat people that look queer, that look brown. So, you know, when you talk about just ignore them, I think very early into Trump's president, or maybe right after Charlottesville, there was, Unite the Right. People from Charlottesville really hate it when you use their town as a metonym for a racist event. There was like a skit on SNL of like Tina Fey like saying, just stay in and eat sheet cake. And she called it sheet caking. Like when racists come to your town, like, no, don't do that. Throw the cake. You know, but it's like this complacency and also valorizing complacency. And also, again, marginalizing people who are actively opposing these groups, putting their bodies on the line to defend community members, you know, who don't want to be assaulted for walking around while being Black, you know, or looking queer. Like when you give these groups free rein, when you give these groups platforms, when you debate them, you know, you start from the assumption that they are legitimate in ways that they are simply not. So I am not willing to debate anyone about whether I, as a Jew, like am a secret ruler of the damn world, you know, who deserves to be gassed. I'm not gonna talk to someone who starts from that position. It's much easier for someone who's not a target, I suppose, to engage in these questions as if they are dispassionate intellectual questions, but they are not. They simply are not. So yeah.
I think there's also we're this is obviously a Portland event. Like we live in Oregon, there's very clear evidence. The evidence is not like mixed about whether or not ignoring events pans out well. So like in Oregon, for example, over in Idaho and Hayden Lake, there used to be the Aryan Nations compound, and they would send organizers over to Oregon in the 80s and 90s. They would send organizers in to basically put out flyers, see if anyone raised hay. If people raised hay, they thought, okay, maybe that wasn't the place for them, and they'd go on to the next place. They'd literally feel things out to see if they get resistance. This has happened for decades. They come in, try and see, can I hold an event here? Could I recruit? Will I have touchstones in the community? And if I do, then if no one's going to fight back, then we'll continue that. And so that is what they're looking for. They're looking for access to speech, access to make the case, access to recruit people that are in tough times, the access to appropriate other movements. And you can see that evidence is really, really, really clear that when they are shut down in their infancy, when people do what it takes to shut them down, like their organizations, to end their events, to disrupt their attempts at recruitment, that is what works every single time. And so this idea that we can ignore them and they'll go away, I think, again, is based on this notion that passive action is always what's going to be necessary, instead of actually kind of severing that line, because cutting their speech, their ability to recruit, is what ends up ending it.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's this sort of idolization of passivity, which makes people feel better about their own passivity or their own sort of lack of like fundamentally not giving a shit about the victims of fascism. Like, I mean, yeah, sorry for any profanity. I mean, the other thing about the sort of ignore them and they'll go away, like, first of all, it's just not true. It's like ignoring cancer. No, the tumor is just going to grow. You can't just like drink fruit juice and be out of it. There is sort of a tactical debate that can be had over, like, so for example, you know, George Lincoln Rockwell, who was the head of the American Nazi Party in the 60s and was assassinated by one of his own proteges, Yamel Shamo. He very specifically would go to like very liberal cities. Like he came to New York, he went to Boston, he went to like the premiere of Exodus with his Nazis. And he would say like, oh, every time we get beaten up, it's good press. Like it gets written up in the press, we get written about. So there is a tactical question of like, when should we engage in sort of street confrontation versus when you know, that's sort of often miscast by a fundamentally like right-leaning and, more to the point, institutionalist press that doesn't trust sort of non-state actors, versus when should we engage in sabotage behind the scenes. So a very effective, one very effective set of countermeasures was Patriot Front did a march in Philadelphia, but anti-fascists sort of secretly came in and slashed their tires of their cars and of most of the transport trucks they'd used. They were sort of stuck in the cold for like hours until they like slowly straggled into a U-Haul, and then we're all like stuck in a parking lot. So the event got like broadly ridiculed, and only months later the anti-fascists sort of anonymously came out and said, by the way, the reason this was such a ridiculous failure was because we had infiltrated the group, we knew where they were going to be parked, we slashed various tires, and like, you know, we made the event a laughing stock. So that kind of tactic can be effective too, or just like calling a hotel and saying like, hey, like, you know, like you're hosting a white nationalist conference and I'm going to tweet about it, like stuff like that. Or, you know, as the Charlottesville anti-fascist community did, tried to get, like, they knew Unite the Right was going to be a debacle, a horror. They had been attacked by the Klan, and, you know, it was the culmination of a summer of hate. And so they desperately asked for the permit to be revoked for the march. And in a moment that sort of indelibly sealed my view on the sort of fascists have a right to free speech too moment, the ACLU actually sued on Jason Kessler's behalf and won to get his permit reinstated for a march that again terrorized his city and resulted in a woman's death and the paralysis and injury of many others. So, you know, and a man being beaten almost to death by white supremacists, DeAndre Harris. So again, I think one of the things that I think people just like observing this stuff, like question your pieties, question the things that make you feel good, question who you villainize, and don't villainize enough. You know, I think there are a lot of very treacly stories that people tell themselves to mask either their fundamental indifference or their fundamental sympathy to members of these groups.
You know, this gets me to a question. There's like a couple people asked kind of similar questions, which is basically like, what can I do? I'm not really an organizer. Like, what could I do to participate? And I think they kind of get at that is that there's not this one, I think, one way to participate. This is sort of like, we've been working on this anti-fascism anthology. It tries to open up the question is like, what does it mean to be an anti-fascist? And there's a whole range of different things. There's different ways to participate in actions to stop those things. There's different ways of creating kind of community groups that sustain them. There's mutual aid groups that support people around to have the kind of life stability to be able to engage in activism. There's all kinds of things that I think people can do. I know, what kind of ideas do you give to folks that are like maybe nervous to come to a protest that's not their bag? They want to try other things.
So I'm going to drop a link in the chat. It's a wonderful little publication called 40 Ways to Fight Fascists, Street Legal Tactics for Community Activists, written by Spencer Sunshine, who is a longtime anti-fascist. And it gives you a lot of different suggestions, but like there are a ton of ways to engage in anti-fascism in ways that are big and that are small. And like, not everyone is a street brawler. I am not a street brawler. I have agoraphobia and panic disorder and barely leave my house, right? You can do research, figure out what's up in your town, you know, what hate groups are around. I mean, in Portland, you've got that covered pretty much, but like maybe you live in a suburb, maybe there's a hate group in your suburb. Figure out, you know, like attend some school board or local meetings and like see what you can do to, you know, advance sort of social justice in that regard. You know, you can like there are as many ways to fight fascism. It can even be like making anti-fascist movement music, making anti-fascist art, you know, working to sway the opinions of your friends and peers, like talking about it publicly, you know, research into like, who are these white nationalist group members in my town? What roles do they play? What power do they have? There are many, many ways to do it. As many skills and talents as there are around, they can be deployed in service of the anti-fascist cause. I think, again, like that, that pamphlet is a great start. You can download it for free at that link. But just like, don't start from a position of helplessness, of just consuming the news passively. You know, if you say to yourself, I can help fight fascism in this country, you can. Like, and it can be anything from like attending, again, like, you know, one story that I heard recently was like some, you know, a school board, I believe it was in Tennessee, had been bombarded by anti-trans activists who were trying to get, you know, transphobic legislation passed, or changes made in the school system of that county. And a group of LGBT activists just showed up. I mean, it was like 40 of them, and they showed up to every meeting and they made their opposition known. They did not let themselves be drowned out by a loud and hateful minority. And I think this sort of internalized passivity, this notion of I can't really do anything, or I'm not suited for this, or it takes some sort of commando to be an anti-fascist. No, it doesn't. It just takes doing something, caring about it, caring about the actual impact of these groups on people's lives rather than your own ego. And, you know, it can be done. And the more people participate, you know, the easier it will be to crush these groups that want nothing but violence and death and destruction.
Yeah, there was this example I was talking about with someone earlier many years ago when there was a David Irving event. He's a very famous Holocaust denier, maybe the most famous Holocaust denier, and at
A schmuck.
at a La Quinta event, and they wouldn't cancel his event, even though we called and let him know. They're like, well, he booked his rooms, he's got a space. So we started getting call-ins and stuff, and I called a friend that I'd gone to high school with that ran like 24 mom groups that had a total of like something like 2 million people in like these groups that were just like about like, I know, sharing like different like tips and resources and stuff. So she put the phone number in there, and they got like 10,000 phone calls in 2 days of people like all around the world really pissed off about this. So they called not just that La Quinta, but every La Quinta in the country until it became like corporate policy to shut down any of this kind of thing. So I feel like those are the kinds of things anyone can participate in something. Like there are ways of building campaigns that sort of involve everybody. It kind of brought me to.
I would also add that the vast majority of anti-fascist action happens behind the scenes, and it's like women and queer people and like small groups all across the country doing a lot of stuff to make sure that it doesn't get to the point of punches on the street. Those are the last necessity, and what almost everyone except, I mean, anti-fascists can also be dumb. So like, yeah, there are people that see it as all glamour and dressing in black and brawling. Sure, that exists. But the vast majority of people like don't want it to get to that point where fascists are marching down the street in your town, and will do everything they can behind the scenes, you know, or in ways that aren't immediately obvious to the public, to discredit, to deplatform, to sow discord and confusion, to dismantle these groups, you know, without it ever coming to sort of actions on the street or even actions that are visible to the wider public. And that's something I think people fundamentally misunderstand.
You know, the thing that generally keeps me up at night, or the thing that I know that's most personally threatening, and we've talked about this, is what's sort of called, but maybe shouldn't be called, like lone wolf attacks. So this is something like you'll hear, like, you know, in the media talk about a lone wolf attack. It's like an unaffiliated white nationalist who goes into a synagogue and opens fire or targets somebody. And if, like, for example, I get like an individual threat, that might be interpreted as a lone wolf if that person has nothing, no correlation to another organization. But I know your new book that you're working on, and that's something we've talked about, is that there is really no lone wolf. They're tied to a larger movement. There's responsibility to go around. There is a group, even if people don't necessarily recognize it. How do you think that dynamic works?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's telling what we talk about as sort of lone wolf terrorism. It's almost exclusively white supremacist terrorism. So if you have any link, for example, to an Islamist group, even if it's not sort of you've never been to a meeting or whatever, like you've Google searched something to do with jihad, like you, it's legible you're part of a movement, but somehow every white supremacist is a lone wolf. Dylan Roof and, you know, all these people are viewed as sort of individuals. And I think that speaks to who is individuated, who is given sort of the agency of being an individual, and also like what aspects of our society are we not willing to condemn. And the other piece of it to me is like, I am interested in the many types of communities that give rise to extremism. So at the moment, the bulk of the book thus far has been about evangelical Christian approaches to child rearing. There's just like so much violence in it. It's very frightening. You know, reading like these parenting manuals like God the Rod and Your Child's Bod, and you know, just like all these parenting manuals that straight up tell you to beat your kids harshly from infancy. And so I've been thinking about that as a vector of extremism. Talking about, you know, I'm reading Quiverful by Catherine Joyce, which is about basically there is a Christian movement to have as many kids as possible and then raise them to be extremely political. We certainly see, like with the Federalist Society, a steady radicalization of an institution, the judiciary. You know, so there are many methods of radicalization, and most of them are movementarian. You know, these are systems, and we have to understand them as systemic. We have to understand them as broader than one person, and every person that decides to engage in an act of white supremacist terror has spent usually years marinating in an entire sort of primordial ooze of stochastic terror, whether on the internet or in person, you know, and that's very intentional. The idea is to sort of radicalize people into committing acts of violence, but also maintain the plausible deniability of being like, well, you know, he just read our stuff. He was just in our chat, whatever. But no, there's no such thing as a lone wolf, or rather there is a lone wolf. There are lone wolves in nature, but they're mostly wolves that just like go off to find like better feeding grounds and like new mates. They're not like rogue monster killers. But I think this is a slur on wolves.
It does sort of unseat everybody from responsibility. Like the new ways that these social movements work are a lot more diffuse, they're spread out more, and it's a lot easier to make the case that someone, oh, they're just totally disconnected. But there's been literally no kind of alt-right killer or white nationalist killer that didn't have some very clear connection to establishment white nationalist organizations. You know, Dylan Roof was radicalized by the Council of Conservative Citizens website. Other folks were very active on alt-right forums and stuff. So there is a movement there, even when they want to claim that it's not organizationally sanctioned, because it usually isn't organizationally sanctioned. It's sanctioned ideologically through relationships, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, also like the notion of stochastic terror. So if people are not familiar, it's this idea of you sort of consistently encourage violence and you saturate your rhetorical environment with incitement to violence and with images of violence, and then hope that someone takes the dare, you know, and that's essentially what you see in every far right chat. Should we address like all the various questions from Portlanders who say Antifa is violent and they're thugs and bad? I mean, my preliminary take is like, you have a lot of fascists from all over Oregon that come to Portland. Why aren't you worried about that instead of the people that are fighting them?
Well, as someone who's been down there and seen that and been attacked by white nationalists, the far right, and police, that's just factually wrong. Like the body count is packed up on the far right, not on the left. And generally, the anti-fascist movements here have been there literally to protect the advancement of white nationalist groups. So I know that, like,
protect against the advance,
right? Yeah, protect against the advance of white nationalists. That there's a direct line between having anti-fascist groups present and keeping the rest of the community safe, shutting down those events and stopping them from showing up. And the decline of groups like Joey Gibson's Patriot Prayer and the Proud Boys from showing up, that's a direct result of the fact that there are a mass movement to shut them down anytime they do come. That's what works. It's been demonstrable, and there's really no debate on it.
And also don't like like when I talk, I have a chapter about this in my book, but like news coverage of anti-fascists is very often shaped by the fact that anti-fascists, by the nature of their work, are mostly anonymous. Like people don't want their lives threatened, their families threatened, their kids or parents threatened, you know, as like, and I as a public anti-fascist have endured all of these things, right? Not everyone wants that as a lifestyle, especially people who are doing riskier operations than mine, you know, which is sort of fundamentally a journalistic and a proselytizing kind of a mission. You know, the my like, you know, the people who are anti-fascist don't necessarily want to be targeted by the far right. So you have, on the one hand, you have sort of a fundamentally decentralized, largely anonymous movement. On the other hand, you have the cops who despise anti-fascists, and you have white nationalists. And so the press is not necessarily always, but sometimes quite sympathetic to white nationalists. You'll often see them in these sort of soft focus, humanizing profiles, but also the bias I think that is principally at play is an institutionalist bias. So if you're a journalist, it's much easier to say authorities say, police claim, you know, to have a name, a sort of press office you can call. And I've been a reporter, I know it, right? Versus sort of trying to suss out the truth on, you know, like fora and on trying to, you know, communicate with a movement that's pretty opaque and also has very good reasons to distrust the press. It's sort of a self-reinforcing cycle. But at any rate, there's just like a pretty relentless media portrayal of anti-fascists as violent, as thugs, as destructors, you know, and very little attempt to understand them because, you know, it's much easier, both in terms of meeting your deadline and, you know, making sure you have sort of an unimpeachable source or whatever, to simply like take the law enforcement line. And I mean, the other thing is just that, like, you know, we know cops lie all the time to journalists, and journalists uncritically sort of, you know, promulgate that. Like the initial press release about George Floyd was that he, you know, had a medical incident. Right? If not for Darnella Frazier, like that would have been the version of his death.
Right.
So, you know, I think take what you hear in the news about anti-fascists with a grain of salt. You can read Shane's book for more, and also mine, if you would like to know more about what anti-fascists actually are and do.
Yeah, and I think like in Oregon specifically, we have multiple generations at this point of anti-fascist organizers that have had to deal with the threat of the far right, the murder of Mulugata Sarah in the 80s, the rise of kind of neo-Nazi skinheads then, of the Klan, of kind of paramilitary groups has been so excessive in Oregon. And the reality is that anti-fascist groups like Anti-Racist Action or Antifa groups have been essential to keeping people safe. And they've done that now for decades. Well, I know like we're rounding up on an hour, so I thought we could kind of close it up and pass it over to Saul. Thanks everyone for putting in the questions and being a part of the conversation. Saul, if you want to introduce any of the upcoming programming.
Hi, first, thank you. Thank you, Talia. Thank you, Shane. I want to thank the sponsors of the event. I want to thank the Costner Cultural Education Fund at the Middleman Jewish Community Center. I want to thank Ojemsha. I want to thank the museum, and I want to thank Judy and Gail Mandel for all their help with the event. I want to thank the Pacific Northwest ADL and the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland for their support. And thank you all for being here today. I know we all learned a lot. And I would also like to, two upcoming events that I will announce on a slightly different vein. Next Thursday, April 7th at noon, the PDX Business Series will have what is next for the Portland real estate market with 4 residential realtors. And there's a whole list of sponsors and co-sponsors for that. And also April 24th is our Walk for the J. We will be fundraising for the JCC. Our plan is to walk from the JCC to Cedars-Sinai Park and go have a party with the residents at Cedars-Sinai Park. So we'll see how that works. And just really grateful for all your support. Talia, it was really a pleasure both having read your book, and I'm glad that, you know, I feel like I reached out to you like, what, a year and a half ago to start this conversation. So I'm
So
glad
many emails. I'm glad it happened.
so many emails and Twitter DMs. So very grateful to have you, and Shane, it was great to meet you. Thank you everybody for being here today. And you know, with Passover coming, may we have a year of peace.
Thank you. Yeah. You know, hopefully no dam, maybe a little Tzfardea if we want. I like frogs, but not too many.
Frogs would be cool.
Yeah. Well, take care, everyone. Have a great night. Thanks, Portland. And take care of yourselves.
Yeah, thanks so much for having
Pass around. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Talia. Great program. Thanks, Shane. Wonderful program.